The vote was 219 to 211, a number that will be studied by political scientists for decades, a seemingly simple arithmetic equation that masks a political earthquake. At exactly 6:27 p.m. on a Wednesday in February, the United States House of Representatives, a chamber controlled by the Republican Party, voted to block the signature trade policy of a Republican president. 6 members of the president's own party crossed the aisle, joining a unified Democratic caucus to strike down the tariffs on Canada, America's closest ally and largest trading partner. It was, by any measure, a frontal assault on executive authority, a rebellion that echoed through the marble corridors of the Capitol and sent a chill across the northern border. But as the final votes were being tallied, as the electronic display boards flashed the green lights signifying the president's defeat, Donald Trump was already watching, and his reaction, posted to his Truth Social platform before the gavel had even fallen, was perhaps the most revealing moment of all. Any Republican in the House or the Senate that votes against tariffs will seriously suffer the consequences come election time, and that includes primaries, he wrote, the capitalization, a familiar signal of raw, unrestrained fury. It was not a concession. It was a declaration of war against his own. To understand the magnitude of this rupture, one must travel back to the origins of this trade war, which predates even the current presidential term. It was in the winter of 2025, just weeks into his new administration, that President Trump first invoked the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, or IEEPA, a law from the 1970s designed to give presidents swift authority to deal with genuine and unforeseen crises. The declared emergency was the flow of fentanyl across the northern border, a tragic problem, but one that customs data showed was statistically insignificant compared to the flow from the southern border. Critics immediately cried foul, seeing it as a legal fiction to justify a protectionist agenda. The tariffs that followed were sweeping and severe. A 25% levy on most Canadian goods and a 10% tariff on Canadian energy products, including oil and electricity. For a nation whose economy is deeply integrated with that of the United States, where supply chains for automobiles, lumber, and agriculture flow back and forth across the border without regard for the invisible line on a map, it was an economic atom bomb. Ontario Premier Doug Ford, whose province is the industrial heartland of Canada, called it a gut punch. In boardrooms from Toronto to Calgary, the initial reaction was not anger, but a profound sense of bewilderment. The Canadian government of Prime Minister Mark Carney initially sought to de-escalate. Carney, a former central banker known for his calm and deliberate demeanor, attempted to engage the White House in private diplomacy. Early signals from the administration had been mixed. Trump himself had once called Carney a smart guy and suggested the bilateral relationship would be strong. But the president's mood, as those close to him often note, is mercurial. The overtures were ignored, and the tariffs remained firmly in place, a constant irritant in a relationship that had, for over a century, been defined by comity and cooperation. The breaking point, the moment that transformed a trade dispute into a geopolitical realignment, came at the World Economic Forum in Davos, Switzerland. Prime Minister Carney, standing before a global audience of elites, delivered a stark address that was interpreted around the world as a direct challenge to the new American order. He declared that the rules-based global order was over and that middle powers like Canada must band together to avoid becoming victims of larger, more predatory nations. He did not name the United States, but he did not need to. The speech drew a standing ovation in the hall and a furious response from the White House. Trump, watching from Washington, saw it as an act of betrayal by a nation he has frequently described as existing only by the grace of American military and economic might. His retaliation was swift and personal. He withdrew an invitation for Canada to participate in a new peace committee he was forming. More dangerously, he escalated the trade war to a new level, threatening 100% tariffs on all Canadian goods in response to Ottawa's quiet diplomatic efforts to normalize trade relations with China. The threat was so severe, so economically catastrophic, that it moved the conflict from the business pages to the front pages of every newspaper in the world. This was the volatile context in which the vote in the House of Representatives unfolded. For nearly a year, Speaker Mike Johnson had acted as a bulwark for the president, using procedural maneuvers to block any and all attempts by Democrats to force a vote on repealing the tariffs. The strategy was simple: prevent the party from having to take a public stance that would expose internal divisions. A rule was passed forbidding any such challenge until the Supreme Court ruled on the legality of Trump's use of IEPA. The dam held, but the pressure behind it was immense. That pressure finally burst on a Tuesday afternoon when the procedural rule protecting the president expired. Speaker Johnson, hoping to buy more time, introduced a new measure that would have extended the blockade until August. It was a gamble, a test of his caucus's loyalty, and he lost. 3 Republicans, Thomas Massie of Kentucky, Don Bacon of Nebraska, and Kevin Kiley of California, joined every single Democrat in voting against the Speaker, effectively green-lighting a full-floor debate on the tariffs for the very next day. The silence from the Republican leadership in the aftermath was deafening. When the final vote came on Wednesday, the trio of defectors grew to a half dozen. They were joined by Dan Newhouse of Washington, Brian Fitzpatrick of Pennsylvania, and Jeff Hurd of Colorado. These were not the usual suspects. They represented a cross-section of the party, from libertarian-leaning conservatives to members from swing districts where agriculture and manufacturing depend on cross-border trade. For Don Bacon of Nebraska, the reasoning was clear and publicly stated: tariffs have been a net negative for the economy and are a significant tax that American consumers, manufacturers, and farmers are paying. The economic data supports this assertion with brutal clarity. According to analysis from Yale University's Budget Lab, the trade war has already cost the average American household approximately $1,700 in lost income last year due to higher prices and market disruptions. The Nonpartisan Tax Foundation put the figure closer to a $1,000 tax increase per household in 2025, projecting it to rise to $1,300 this year. These are the abstract numbers behind the political rebellion. When your constituents are paying more for lumber to build a deck or for a car manufactured with parts that cross the border 4 times, the president's national security argument begins to ring hollow. In his angry all-caps missives from Mar-a-Lago, Trump framed the tariffs as a tool of immense leverage. Tariffs have given us great national security because the mere mention of the word has countries agreeing to our strongest wishes, he posted. For the president, the tariff is not merely an economic tool. It is an extension of his persona, a symbol of strength and dominance in a world he views as inherently adversarial. To vote against them is not a policy difference. It is an act of personal disloyalty. This worldview explains the visceral nature of his threat to primary any Republican who dared to cross him. Yet the rebellion, while historic in its visibility, was always destined to be symbolic in its legislative impact. The resolution now heads to the Senate, where it is likely to pass, given that 4 Republicans joined Democrats in a similar vote last year. From there, it would land on the president's desk, where a veto is guaranteed. And in today's hyper-partisan environment, mustering the 2/3 majority in both chambers necessary to override that veto is a political impossibility, a fact that was not lost on the lawmakers who cast their votes. As one Republican member told Semaphore, speaking on condition of anonymity, "I am no fan of tariffs, but this vote seemed more of a political thing. They knew the bill would die, but they needed to be on record fighting for their districts." But to dismiss the vote as mere political theater is to miss the deeper, more dangerous currents at play. The real story is not the legislative outcome, but the fraying of the transatlantic alliance it represents. For decades, the foundation of American foreign policy has been its network of alliances, none more trusting, more integrated than the one with Canada. That foundation is now cracked. The Canadian government, led by a prime minister who was once publicly friendly with Trump, has begun a quiet but determined pivot. The recent thaw in relations with China, symbolized by the Canada-China Economic Cooperation Roadmap, is a direct consequence of Washington's hostility. This is the nightmare scenario for traditional foreign policy experts: a unified North American bloc splintering under the weight of tariffs and rhetoric. When President Trump threatened 100% tariffs in response to the China talks, he framed it as preventing Canada from becoming a transshipment point for Chinese goods. But from Ottawa's perspective, if the United States closes its market, where else can trade flow? The logic of economics is inexorable. If you block the southern route, the nation must look west across the Pacific. It is a self-fulfilling prophecy. The vote also exposes the limits of Trump's grip on his own party, a crucial development as the November midterm elections loom. For years, the threat of a primary challenge from a Trump-backed candidate has been enough to ensure lockstep loyalty. But the 6 Republicans who voted no calculated, correctly it seems, that the economic pain in their districts outweighed the political risk. Politico reports that even self-identified MAGA Republicans are split on the tariff issue, suggesting that the president's magic is not as potent when it directly conflicts with the cost of living. Democrats, for their part, are eager to exploit this fissure. Representative Gregory Meeks of New York, the sponsor of the resolution, made no secret of his strategy. "Our fight doesn't stop here," he said, announcing plans for similar resolutions to block tariffs on Mexico, Brazil, and the sweeping Liberation Day global tariffs. For the minority party, this is a golden opportunity to force vulnerable Republicans into a series of impossible votes, defy the president and face his wrath, or support him and be tagged with a tax hike on American families. The international reaction to the House vote has been watched closely in capitals around the world, from Brussels to Beijing. For European allies who are also facing the threat of Trump's tariffs, the message is sobering. Even if there is sympathy for their plight in the U.S. Congress, and even if a majority of lawmakers might vote to help them, the structural reality of the American political system means that one man, armed with the veto pen, can block any relief. The institutional checks and balances that were designed to prevent executive overreach have been blunted by partisan loyalty. Looking ahead, all eyes now turn to the Supreme Court, which is expected to rule soon on the fundamental question of whether Trump's use of IEEPA to impose tariffs is even legal. The U.S. Court of Appeals for the Federal Circuit ruled last August that the law did not authorize such actions, a decision that cast a long shadow over the entire trade war. A Supreme Court ruling against the president would do what Congress cannot, permanently dismantle his tariff regime. Such a ruling would be a historic rebuke, but it would also throw the fate of billions of dollars in trade into a state of chaotic uncertainty. If the court upholds the president's authority, however, the path forward is even more troubling. It would constitutionalize the idea that a president can unilaterally declare an emergency over a minor issue like fentanyl flows from Canada and use it to upend the entire North American economy. It would set a precedent that future presidents of either party could exploit to impose their own trade wars for their own political purposes. The stability of global trade, built on treaties and predictable rules, would be replaced by the whims of whomever sits in the Oval Office. For Canada, the immediate future is one of painful adaptation. The rhetoric from Washington has become increasingly hostile, with the president continuing to refer to Prime Minister Carney as governor, a juvenile taunt that nonetheless signals a profound disrespect for Canadian sovereignty. The trade relationship, once the envy of the world, is now a weapon. Canadian officials, from provincial premiers to federal ministers, have adopted a strategy of public stoicism, refusing to react to every provocation while privately scrambling to diversify their trade portfolio. The most poignant moment in the aftermath of the vote came from Ontario's Doug Ford, who took to social media to thank the American lawmakers who had stood up for the relationship. "An important victory with more work ahead," he wrote, striking a tone of cautious optimism that felt almost tragically out of place. "Let's end the tariffs and together build a more prosperous and secure future." It was a plea for a return to normalcy from a man who represents a province that would be devastated by a prolonged trade war. But normalcy, it seems, is no longer an option. The vote in the House was not a solution. It was a symptom. It revealed a Washington that is deeply divided, an executive branch that views allies with suspicion, and a legislative branch that is too weak to offer anything more than symbolic protest. The 219 members who voted to block the tariffs were sending a message of support to Canada, but it was a message written in sand, certain to be washed away by the rising tide of a presidential veto. Donald Trump's reaction, the furious promise of political vengeance, was the reaction of a man who understands that the vote was not about tariffs at all. It was about authority. It was about whether the Republican Party exists to represent its constituents or to serve its leader. His threat to primary the dissidents is a threat to purge anyone who dares to suggest that the interests of a farmer in Nebraska or a manufacturer in Pennsylvania might sometimes diverge from the interests of the man in the White House. As this long-form investigation concludes, the picture that emerges is not one of a government functioning, but of a system straining at its seams. The U.S.-Canada relationship, built on the blood of soldiers who fought together at Vimy Ridge and on the beaches of Normandy, on the integrated circuits of auto plants in Detroit and Windsor, on the pipelines and power lines that crisscross an undefended border, is now hostage to a political standoff in Washington. The House vote was a flicker of resistance, a brief moment where sanity appeared to prevail, but it was fleeting, and the future from this vantage point looks dark. The alliance that won the Cold War and built the most prosperous economic zone in human history now faces its most serious test, not from a foreign adversary, but from within.